Welcome, good afternoon. I'm so glad you managed to show up for this second to the last talk. Just to start off, I'd like to always sort of level set and get a better understanding of who's in the room. And I'm sorry if you've done this before, but it just helps me get a sense of where you're all coming from and what you're bringing to this conference. So out of curiosity, how many of you actually work in an agency context? Okay, there's a fair number, actually. And how many of you work inside of a corporation within marketing,